very warm welcome to my community, I'm sure, with McCaskey. It is the People's Program that allows the people the opportunity to share that rich history of their communities and so enrich the lives of all of us. Well, this week my task is a very simple one. I'm introducing to you Miles Eversley, who from time to time will be presenting my community. Miles?
Thank you, Sherwood. In our last program, Ronald Ronnie D. Davis regaled us with stories of life in Blades Hill, St. Philip. This week we travel southwards to Lynches and Merricks, communities which helped shape and fashion the life of Ona Harewood. Over to you, Ona.
In Barbados, we say it takes a village to raise a child. And if I can talk about the village that raised me, if I can use that analogy, then I would be talking about communities like Lynches, Apple Hall, Bentham's, Merricks, Eastbourne. Small communities that people probably never heard of back in the day, but that was our village, if I can more that concept. And I think a lot of the people that we became as adults, me and my peers, was largely shaped by our experiences in the village. The things we saw, the things we heard, and most definitely the people that we encountered. And it helped to shape our attitudes and mores and values and made us who we are, in a nutshell. Now, we took time as children and as young people to explore the village. We called it exploring. My grandmother and the older people thought we were gallivanting. But definitely the vacation was the time to get out. And the Easter vacation was two things, canes and kite flying. And during that time, we had some small cane farmers in the community. I remember there was a lady called Miss Jones. I wasn't allowed to call her anything else but Miss Jones, right? Because my grandmother wouldn't have it. And she had a patch of land where she grew canes. And she cut them the old-fashioned way. So you would see the cane cutters with the bill or the cutlass or whatever the apparatus was that they were using at the time. Collins. And she would pile, they would be piled, and then a motor lorry, they would be loaded onto the motor lorry and taken to the factory. Now, we were allowed to take some of her cane, but you had to ask. Once you asked, it was fine. I think she got pretty upset if you didn't ask. If she caught you and you didn't ask. So I knew, because she was friends with my grandmother, that I had to ask. So I was never one of those people who got caught taking without asking. So I would go over to her and knock on the door and I would politely ask her if I could have some cane. And there was apparently a special kind of cane that I was supposed to pick out. My grandmother made sure that I didn't bring any hard cane home. So I would, go and select the cane myself and I would bring them home and my grandmother would then peel them and split them up and I would have those. River Plantation at the time was still in the cane business. But that was a lot further away. When it was time to cut the cane, harvest the cane at the plantation, it was done manually. At some point in time, I recall it being done manually. So you would see the workers in the field and you would see the canes being loaded and piled and stuff like that. And of course, that was our first introduction, more or less, to the sugarcane industry and what it was about. A lot of us, all of the young people, all of the children, we would get together and we would go over to River Plantation and we would get cane from there as well. Right, so River Plantation was a very interesting place for us as children and as young people growing up because there was so much going on. I think there was an old mill, the remnants of a mill. I don't know if it was ever in production at the time when we were going around. And then there was all these bits and pieces of machinery. We weren't really sure what they were for. But the big drawing point at River Plantation was the pond. No matter what time of the year it was, that pond was always full of water. I don't know if it was fed by an underground spring, and the pond had fish. So a lot of the guys would go fishing in the pond and us girls would follow. We would catch thousands and take them home and stuff, much to my mother's distress. But I remember the first time I held a fishing rod was at River Pond. And we were being taught, the guys were teaching the girls how to fish. And I remember having the rod and watching with the bait and I could see it in the water. And I remember the fish swam up and had the bait and looked at me and went on his merry way. And I didn't realize that at that point I was supposed to hook the fish. So the fish went away, probably thanking me for breakfast, and I was left there just like, I think the guys got fed up with us after a while, and they abandoned the fishing lesson. So I never, ever held a fishing rod again. But those were some of the times that we had exploring the village. Now, the kite flying. Now, I was a girl. So as far as my grandmother was concerned, I should really be in the house doing something that girls should do during the vacation. But us girls thought, why should the boys have all the fun? So we wanted to fly kites as well. And the thing about it is we made our kites, and we made all types of kites. So if you look at a dry cane blade, there's a little bone in the middle, and we used to call it a trash bone because it was cane trash. And that cane blade is what we used to make the kites. And we would make the kite, you would frame it out, and then you would get paper to cover it. Now, my mother was not buying any paper for me to cover any kite. That was not going to happen. So what we did, we had to be creative. So what we did is we would save the comic strip from the Sunday paper. And back then, the Advocate newspaper was broadsheet, so it was a long, big piece of thing. And the comics were in color. So we used to save the comic strips to cover the kite. That way we could introduce color into the kite, because like I said, nobody was paying us any money with buying kite paper for us to cover these kites. And we would then paste the kite with all kinds of things, clammy cherry if you could get that, or I even experimented at one point with flour paste. But I had glue for school, so I thought I have glue equals kite making. So much to my mother's distress, all of my glue that I was supposed to keep for school was used to cover my kites. And then we got strips of material, anything that was old that we could take, and that made a tail, and then it was to find the string. Now again, I thought that I could encourage my mother to buy some twine. Didn't happen. So we used embroidery floss, that embroidery thread, and we would use that to fly the kite. The thing about the trash bone kite, right, is that the trash bone was very thin. It wasn't something that was sturdy or strong. So you get the kite in the air and it fly for a little while. Maybe it lasts a day or two, but eventually the bone will break and we have to start over and make another one. So all of the Easter vacation was spent making and flying kites. Eventually, I think we graduated to wood, but that was another point of distress for my grandmother. I think she was a little concerned that I was chopping up wood with a cutlass. And I mean, we were little people, so... But I wanted to fly a kite. I realized very early that this trash bone wasn't going to be something that I could work with. So we graduated into wood, and we would fly our kites made of wood. I remember one day, I think my grandmother got fed up because I was outside. We had an open area behind the house, and we were all assembled to make and fly these kites. So as soon as you got up and you had breakfast, you were outside. Lunchtime came, you're still outside. And I think she got a little upset that I was still outside and I was spending the whole day outside, and she came to get me. So I figured, well, since I didn't want to get lashes in public, I would go meet her and I would go in. So I went in and I went through the back door. By the time my grandmother got to the back door, I was going back out through the front door, back onto the passes to fly the kite. So that was largely what the Easter vacation was about. Now the summer vacation was of course like 9 weeks. And this was where we had more time to explore the neighborhood. And I remember that some mornings we would leave home as early as 6:30. We would say we're going jogging, you know, and we would sometimes make our way down to Short Hole. And from Short Hole, we would move up to Long Bay, and then from Long Bay we would move to Taylor Bay, Harry Smith, we called it Taylor Bay. And from there on to Bottom Bay, Sioux Bay, and Peak Bay. So we spent an entire day going from area to area to area. And there was no issue with lunch. I mean, we ate whatever we could find. There was grapes, we had fat pork. The guys would climb the tree and we would get coconuts. And I don't know if you know wilks, but wilks were these flat, like crustaceans. They were stuck to the sea rocks, and we would dig them off. We would wash them out in the sea and we would eat them. If you were fortunate, sometimes the guys would roast them and everybody would eat. And, you know, you got back home in the afternoon and you would get your dinner and it was fine. There were dunce trees, gooseberry trees, and the thing about it is back then we didn't have the developments that we have today. So there was no Casuarina Estates, there was no Inchcape Terrace, there was no Apple Hall Terrace. That was all empty open pasture with lots of dunks trees and gooseberry trees and grapes. And those were the things that we ate as children. I mean, snacks were the things that you could pick and eat. And that kept us going as we were out running around and exploring. But I remember one day we did our usual. We left home early in the morning. And I mean, it was a lot of us because everybody from the neighborhood would be part of this exploration. And I got back home, and as I stepped into the yard, I knew immediately that something was wrong. When I got a little further, I saw my mother in the back door. Now, I knew that I would go and do my exploration, and I would get back home before my mother got home from work. Somehow, she came home early that day. I think the water was off at her workplace and they sent them home. So when I got home, she was home. And I didn't know what to do. So I made my way to the house and she's standing in the back door. And I could tell from the look on her face, this wasn't going to go well, right? So what I did, I said, oh, hello, good afternoon. And she said, where you know come from? So I thought it was going to be smart. I said, well, you know, we went jogging because jogging is healthy. I'm engaged in exercise. It did not work. I got lashes. I got lashes for being, my grandmother would say she was out all day and she didn't know where it was and what I was doing. And I remember I got some good lashes that day. But that didn't stop us. I mean, you know, you went back the next day and you did what you had to do. So that was all part of life in the neighborhood as we grew up. But you really have to be careful because I grew up on this Atlantic Ocean thing, you know. We didn't have any calm water, so Shark Hole was rough, Long Bay was rough, Bottom Bay was rough. It was just rough water and you really had to be careful. And I think my mother always used to hold her breath when she heard that I went to the beach because the possibility of drowning was so real, right? We never thought about any drowning. We just had fun in the water. But I actually almost drowned once. But funny enough, it wasn't on this side. My grandfather was from Bel Air. And I used to spend vacations with my grandfather. So we were at Beachy Head. And we decided we were going out to the reef. The boys said, oh, let's go to the reef. I thought, why not? I could not swim, right? So we had the pole that the guys used for diving sea eggs. And there were 3 girls and 2 boys. So the boys were at the front and the back. And we were in the middle. And we encountered a swell. I mean, it was a big wave. And normally you ride with the wave. But this one knocked us completely off the pole. And I couldn't swim. So I'm scrambling and drinking all this water. I really thought I was going to die that day. But what happened is one girl remained on the pole. So the guys jumped off and came to the 2 of us who were floundering. And they brought us back to shore. And I would not tell you, when I stepped onto the sand, my 2 legs gave way. Because I was so scared and I sat on the beach and I had to collect myself. I didn't think I told my mother about that until I was like well into adulthood, right? So that was my near drowning experience. But the thing is, you learn to swim as you went along because the guys would just toss you out and you had to do something. And that's how most of us, I suppose, eventually learn to swim. But all fun, all fun. I mean, I had an experience at Sam Laur's Beach where I was boogie boarding. No, I really know how to do no boogie boarding. And I was on this board. Somebody had a surfboard. I was on the board and I got a wave. I caught a wave and I was coming in on the wave. And then the wave crashed. And I didn't know how to get off the wave, so I crashed. And my stomach had a burnout because I tossed out on the sand and it was rough on it. All part of life in the village, you know. All part of life in the village. Let's talk about the shops. Because like any Barbadian community, our communities had the neighborhood shops. And we were talking about a fairly small area. Many communities, but a fairly small space. And a little girl, I remember there was a shop on the main road of Well House going towards Merrick's that was run by a man called Ori. He didn't stay around long from what I can recall. So I guess by the time I came along, that had been an established shop. But I would have gone to that shop once or twice with my grandmother. And then we had, in Well House, we had Miss Garn's shop. And right next to Miss Garn's was another shop. And I never understood, as a young person, why we had 2 shops side by side. Because it wasn't making sense to me, right? But Miss Garn's was a traditional shop. You got your biscuits, your bread, your feed, the usual things that the shops would sell. and it smelled like a traditional shop. Those shops had a distinct smell. When you went into them, you got that smell. But Mr. Marshall's shop, I think it was this guy called Sam Marshall. His shop now was the interesting shop because he had a pool table and he had a jukebox. I never got to play the jukebox, but I think it was 25 cents or something like that you could put in and you could select your song. So we would go in and we would watch the guys, the men, selecting the songs and so on. I don't think it was a shop though that I could let my grandmother and my mother know that I was going to. But you know, we peeked in and we watched to see what was happening. So that was the jukebox, and we watched this apparatus and we watched the men putting the money and we listened to the songs that they were playing, mostly oldies. So his shop offered something a little different, and I think it was kind of like a watering hole because a lot of the guys would gather there and stuff and have their drinks and play pool and stuff like that. So, and then you had, after Ori's shop went out of business, then you had a lady called Miss Aline. She came in and she was a proprietor for quite some time until she passed away, I think something last year maybe. And again, hers was more or less a traditional shop. But one that always made me laugh was the Handy Dandy. I never understood why it was called the Handy Dandy, but I thought it was a cute name. And as a child, I liked to hear my mother say, she's going to the Handy Dandy. I eventually found out that it was owned by a gentleman that they call Packard and his wife, and then it was taken over by their son. But the memory that I have is of a Mr. Murray Gooden, I think he was, who bought it over. And he used to sell light things. I think there was a pharmacy or something around there, so he would sell pharmaceutical items and stuff. But then his son took it over and rebranded it. So it's still there today, but I think they call it Provigo Mart now. He turned it into something more like a mini mart and modernized it and so on. So that was the Handy Dandy, and for years the Handy Dandy was a big, big feature in the neighborhood. My mother said she would travel there to buy biscuits and so on and so on. The other thing that I recall, that, well, by the time I arrived on the scene, only the ruins were there. But certainly because I inquired, I found out the Shamrock, owned by the famous Lloyd Allen, was also a part of that community. And it was located in Well House. And as a child, I would see the ruins of the building because that's all that was left. But then, you know, when you talk to the older people, they would tell you the story of the Shamrock. And from my recollection and from the conversations that I would have had with the older people in the neighborhood, this was one of the big establishments of the day. And he sold all kinds of things, hardware, supplies, and so on. And it was, apparently he also had his own brand of rum. The Shamrock rum is what they told me. Like I said, by the time I got around, it was just the ruins, but the building was still there. It's not there anymore, but it was still there. And his contribution also to the village was a big contribution as well. I think he even ran for office at some point in time, but he was certainly one of the entrepreneurs of the day who came from that community and made a very valuable contribution. Let's talk about the churches. Now, Merrick's to Eastbourne, small area, many churches, many churches. So in Well House, you had the Methodist Church, Shrewsbury Methodist. And if you came past Shrewsbury Methodist, if you're heading towards Bayfield, and you made that left turn, you would see Grace Bible Church, which was kind of on the corner. I think Grace Bible Church was more of the Baptist kind of persuasion. And then as you proceeded down to Riverland, there were two more churches out there. One was more Pentecostal, I'm not sure, I think the other one was more of a Baptist. So those were four churches, and if you went right, within maybe 1 minute drive from Well House, there was the Seventh-day Adventist Church, Golden Seventh-day Adventist Church. And then in Eastbourne, you had Nanny King. I think she was the person who owned the church, and so the church was associated with her name. I never heard anybody refer to that church by its correct name. It was Nanny King. Oh, you're going by Nanny King? And I was like, who's Nanny King? Oh, that's a church. Okay. And I still don't know today what that church is called because I still refer to it as Nanny King. And then we had another church on Banana Hill. Banana Hill was a little small village sandwiched between River and Lynch's. I have never been able to find out why it was called Banana Hill. I never saw any bananas there, but it was always referred to as Banana Hill. So they had a church as well. And then as you got into Merrick's, there was what was called Proverbs Hall. But I know Proverbs Hall was a New Testament church. But I think the gentleman who ran the church was Mr. Proverbs. And so the older folks associated church with him. So it was Proverbs Hall. And I think that church is still there. So there were plenty of churches. And Sunday school for us was not an option. You had to go. You know, sometimes I felt, I don't want to go to church today. And my mother would come and she would shout for me once. I would answer. She would shout the second time and I wouldn't answer. But I knew the third time she wasn't shouting. So by the time I heard the feet, I knew that I had to be off the bed and looking busy like I was getting ready to go to church. But a lot of us went to Sunday school. You either went to the Methodist church, you went to Grace, but you went somewhere. It was part of the tradition and life in the village to go to Sunday school. And we all went. I mean, we did everything there was to do in church, and we sang the songs, we did the workbooks and everything. But Sunday school was a big part of life in the village. And like I said, it wasn't an option. You just had to go. Your parents said, okay, time for church. And even if they weren't going, you had to go to church. So that culture and tradition was very much alive at that time in the neighborhood. Now the shops were closed on Sundays because, again, back then you didn't really do business on a Sunday at the shop, but you could go around to the back and somebody would still give you something over a window or through the back door. And the shop where the jukebox was located just about 2 buildings down from my church. So sometimes we sneak out there and peep in, and yeah, surely there'll be guys in the shop on a Sunday. You had to go around to the back because the main doors will be closed. But they would be there playing their songs on the jukebox. They're playing mostly oldies. And as we talk about playing mostly oldies, banjo was a no-no at home on Sundays. You could not sing anything secular in the house on Sundays. My grandmother would have a fit if you sing, and they would call you and say, what are you singing? That's a banjo. No banjos in the house on Sunday. So you had to sing your songs you learned in Sunday school. They would play their Jim Reeves and their Chuck Wagon Gang, and Joseph Nels was huge. So those are the things you would hear in the house on Sunday. And you knew that Sunday was a special day. Sunday was a day that was set aside, and that was the day that you went to church, you came back, you had a meal, and you rested, and there was no frolicking, there was no gallivanting, there was no anything on Sunday. You had to observe your Sunday and give respect to the Creator. That was the tradition that I grew up with, and nobody complained because I guess that was basically what it was for in every household, But we didn't deviate too much. We just went with the flow, and I don't think it would be tolerated if you try to get too smart. Those older folks didn't tolerate a lot of things, so you just minded your business and minded your manners, and you said yes please, and you went to church and came home. And sometimes they would ask you what you learned in church too. I remember my grandmother asking me, what you did in church today? And you had to know. You couldn't come home and say, well, I went to church, and not know where you went to church or what you learned in church. You had to be able to say, well, I learned this, the pastor talked about this, the Sunday school teacher said that. Because they wanted to make sure that no, you weren't just going to church, but that you were, as they would say, taking in what the church was trying to teach you. And again, all of that contributed to making us the young people and the adults that we became, because the value systems and so on that we embraced and that we came up with helped to propel us into adulthood. So I don't think, now that I look back on it fondly, sometimes it was a little bit much when you were growing up. But I think that now that I look back on it, I'm not sorry that they did it.
As with many communities around the island, churches played a fundamental role in shaping the minds of young Barbadians. What about folklore, like the steel donkey?
I heard about the steel donkey. My mother said there was some steel donkey somewhere in Marleyville or Bayfield, and she was one, because she would have been a young person at the time. They all went down there to see the steel donkey. I don't think she ever saw the steel donkey. But growing up, I heard the stories, and the older folks in the neighborhood were very terrified of the steel donkey, and they were very careful not to say certain things, and they would always tell you, well, make sure that you look, you don't want a steel donkey. And I never understood what it was about. And I still don't understand what it's about, right? The Heartman, yes, we were all afraid of the Heartman, and we ran in the dark from the Heartman. I don't think I ever really got a good grasp of what the heart man was or who he was or what he looked like or anything like that. And I don't think anybody could tell you what the heart man looked like, but there was a heart man. That much I remember. I would have been really, really small as a child in single digits when I remember the stories were rife about the heart man, and you had to make sure that you were in by a certain time because you didn't want the heart man to catch you. And yeah, we heard all those stories. We heard all the stories because I grew up with the older folks. They passed on all of those superstitions and stories and stuff that were passed down to us, and you dare not dispute it or ask for any evidence or tell them that this wasn't real, because I suppose they believed it. I heard about the traditions of like the 9 mornings and when the lining coal and that kind of thing. My grandmother would say all these things, you know, that body come out too quick, she just had a baby, why you outside, you're not supposed to be outside and things. I had my share of bush tea and purging. If you got sick, my grandmother would give you bush tea for something, and it tasted awful, right? You got cerasy bush, you got this, you got that. And then after every vacation, you had to go through the ritual of purging. Thankfully, I escaped the castor oil. My mother got the castor oil. I got the Epsom salts. And it was the norm. So there was no not doing this or anything like that. It was accepted that this was the way to do it. I mean, my mother never said, well, no purgings. You had to get the purgings. And look, I was so glad when I got to the age when I was able to say I'm not doing that, you know. I mean, even now, that is still the reference point. There's still people in the community who believe it. I think there's some merit in the bush tea and the healing herbs and stuff like that. My grandmother would give you some concoction anytime. If you got cold, there was some concoction she would give you to drink, and it was supposed to make you better and stuff like that. Then, you know, of course, you had all the rubbing up and the putting this on that and the old remedies. So if you got stuck with something, she would make something called a poultice, and there was the hibiscus leaf and the candle, and she would heat it over the thing and put it on your foot and that kind of thing. I think I kind of appreciated some of the folk remedies, and I accept that some of them might have some merit, but I'm not going through any more purgings. No, thank you. I'm thankful for the experience, grateful to be alive, but I'm not doing it anymore. I'm not doing it anymore. But I know there's still some people who do it. A lot of those older people though have passed on. My grandmother died at 93. There were people in the community who lived to 100. I can still see and hear some of them, and I mean, I don't think I will ever forget some of the things that they would say. And sometimes, you know, we reminisce and we talk and we laugh and we go back to the old days. Even the standpipe. I remember as a child, people still went to the standpipe. Some people bathed under the standpipe. And no matter how the water went off in the neighborhood, the standpipe always had water. I never understood that. My pipe was off, everybody, but the standpipe had water. So we would go to the standpipe and we would get water from the standpipe. I don't know. And you would bring your water home in your buckets and stuff like that. And you will have water. By the time I came along, of course there was electricity and stuff like that. There was rediffusion and some of those things that we had, but it was a very, very, very different time. We played under the street light. We didn't have any gadgets. We played outside. We played all the games that children played back then under the street light. You know, Michael Jackson was big at one point, so we all practiced the break dancing outside and stuff like that. And we had fun. So life was more outdoors for us than indoors. Not everybody had a television, so you went where you could to watch TV. I remember my mother insisted that I listen to Children's Corner every Saturday morning with Auntie Olga. Religiously, no matter how I protested, you had to listen to Children's Corner because she thought that there was something valuable in it. And so I had to listen. And sometimes she would quiz you too on what it is that you heard. So you had to pay attention, right? Because you had to be able to say what you heard. So those were the things that we kind of had to deal with, but all in good stead and all fun, all fun. I mean, I think that my experience in the village is not one that I would trade at all.
Sentiments echoed throughout Barbados. Thank you, Ona, for sharing memories of life in Lynches, and thank you, the viewers, for staying with us. Do join us next week as Ona shares about entertainment and the contribution of Bailey's Primary School, among others. I am Miles Eversley. Thanks for your time. Goodbye.
People always